Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for this very warm introduction, and warmly welcome you, all of you. Good morning to this session. In this very chilly, windy, and raining, but typical New York spring morning. And we are extremely honored and privileged to have Dr. Kissinger with us this morning. And you heard all the background. I don't think I need to add anything, but I think really the one thing is Dr. Kissinger is still the most influential strategist and thinker in the world today, and the right comments on all different issues from Ukraine to Iran and in the past few years, and still keep his eyes on the issues in the different corner of the world. So good morning, Dr. Kissinger. It's a great honor, and particularly for me, to have this opportunity to have a conversation with you. Since we are in the Asia society, I think it's only proper for me to start this conversation with Asia. Right.
It won't surprise me.
Good. That's very good. I will have no surprise on you at all, because you know everything. So no worry. Many people talk about the 21st century is Asian century. Do you agree?
It depends how you define it. Because I would argue that there really is no Asia that is a unit. The history of South Asia and history of East Asia are really quite different. And South Asia has been connected with the Middle East and with Europe in a totally different way from the way China and East Asia has been connected. So, and there are very few institutions that deal with Asia as a unit. So if the question is, will the gross national product of China and of India over a period of time exceed that of the United States on that statistical basis, it could happen. But it's unlikely that one will see a unified Asian bloc vis-a-vis an American bloc, so that the question of whether the next century is the century of Asia or the century of something else is not really fully relevant to what we see. It is clear that the degree of domination that the United States exercised in the previous century cannot be repeated in the 21st century, and should not be attempted in the 21st century.
No, that's a very important point you just mentioned. But the current government does have sort of a back to Asia strategy, right? And sort of take Asia as a whole. What is your take? And how do you see the implementation for this strategy so far? You just mentioned in the last century's policy may not necessarily relevant to this century. But how do you see this strategy, and how do you see this strategy roll over in the next 10 years?
You know, one always has to distinguish between the slogans that are used to explain certain policies to the American public and what the substance of that policy is. Now, when you say back to Asia, I know a lot of Asians who say to me, we didn't know you had ever left. And those of us who've been engaged with Asian policy have never had a sense that the United States actually left Asia. So what was meant by this movement really meant that the United States forces were withdrawing from Afghanistan. So therefore the proportion of forces of our total forces in Asia became greater So yes, Asia is a key element of strategy, of American strategy. But I'm uneasy about defining it as focused entirely on Asia or largely on Asia, or of thinking that this is radically different from what's been done before.
Good. In your first point, you're very interesting. You say there's no sort of a general concept about Asia because Asia is so different, which is very true. But you also say that just a few months ago, you say Asia is more in a position of 19th century Europe. And you say, well, the military conflict is not ruled out. Can you give us a little bit more your thought on this line?
Well, European history is hundreds of years of war, of the various political units in Europe and sovereign states at war with each other. And that ended with World War II. Among the European countries today, one can say that the use of force against each other is, for all practical purposes, excluded. And they are creating institutions that are designed to move over time into a coherent single political unit. In Asia, the use of force is not excluded. It's not preferred, but in the conflicts between China and Japan, in the South Sea Island issues, and in the issues of other Asian countries with each other without China, there's always the latent threat of the use of force. So from that point of view, it is more similar to the 19th century Europe than to the 21st century Europe. For most Asian countries, the experience of decolonization is the most significant experience of this, political experience of this generation. And so they have agendas that have not been fulfilled, cannot be quickly fulfilled. So there is a lot more impetus behind the national efforts than you would see in Europe today, which is more bureaucratic and more... Mm-hmm. And that's a fundamental difference. Europe, as an institution, focuses on soft power. Asia has both elements.
With this difference, do you see a different way to solve the tension between China and Japan? Assume your advisor for Prime Minister Abe today. What will be your advice to him?
I would advise both sides.
Yeah, that's my second part of the question.
I would give both of them the same advice. Mm-hmm. To be extremely restrained in their conduct and not to permit that situation to develop into a military confrontation. Because a military confrontation will confront everybody with really very difficult problems to solve. And we as Americans, being allied to Japan, but in partnership of some kind with China, we shouldn't be put into the position to choose. And we should make clear to both sides that we will be sympathetic and helpful, but we are strongly opposed to a military confrontation, which really would have huge consequences in the region. I don't say that I have a solution to the problem, because in the end, both sides will have to give up something. And there was a solution that there was a state of affairs that was quite manageable when Japan had administrative control, but since there's no one living on the island, you didn't quite know what that meant. But nobody claimed sovereignty. And Deng Xiaoping, when he was in Japan in '79, said he didn't know what that arrangement meant, but we should try to live by it. Something like that ought to be at the end of that process. Because sooner or later, Japan and China will move towards cooperation.
That's very important and the point. Now, you give your advice to both China side and Japanese sides. What is your advice to the U.S. government on this issue? What the role U.S. should and can play?
My position to the U.S. government in general is that I don't volunteer advice. Because
I understand that you have a company.
I'm sometimes asked, I'm happy to say I haven't been asked in this case. My advice to the U.S. government would also be to avoid any inflammatory. We should not, in that area, anybody, any one of the three countries, exercise military demonstrations if it can possibly be avoided.
So you mentioned in the first the sentence, and this century is very different from the previous century. So the older methods not necessarily work in these centuries. So what do you mean for the U.S.-Asian sort of a policy? Do you see you need a new policy, U.S. need a new policy toward Asia, or?
Well, in the previous century, in the kind of foreign policy even that I was brought up on, one would have said, if you see two countries dealing with each other, the first thing you have to understand is the balance of power between them. And then you have to see what allies they can get. And then you have to define what is your national interest in that. I don't think that it's appropriate for the present situation. First, I don't think the basic equation between America and Asian countries is or should be military. Secondly, I believe in every Chinese-American communique, it has been said that both sides are opposed to hegemony, so that neither of them wants to dominate Asia. They've said it, but they have not given it as much practical application as they made. So when one reads the media, one hears of, in America, of growing Chinese military might, and in China, of American attempts to keep China down. And if that is assessed in purely military terms, then the evolution is almost bound to be that two rigid sets of alliances will confront each other, and that is likely to have the consequences that always occurs when you have two rigid alliances. So I think the relationship between America and Asia, and especially the relationship between America and China, must be a manifold combination in which you have partnership and also a balance of power, but in which the balance of power does not become the dominant element. But to conduct both of these policies simultaneously is going to be very complicated for both sides. And unless both sides conduct it, there's a danger of misapprehension. My impression is that the leaders of both sides understand this. I'm not so sure that they have yet convinced all of their bureaucracies.
This is a very insightful thoughts. And just take between the China and the US. You mentioned sort of balance of power, but also build a partnership.
Right.
Yeah. How can we put these two things together? What is the architecture for this genius idea, which is obviously very important for today's international affairs?
We should not, when two major countries interact with each other this way, it's very hard to give an abstract formula, because these are two societies that have no experience in this kind of relationship. America has never had to deal with a country of approximately equal size that also energetically engages itself in peaceful pursuits. With Russia, it was a largely, almost exclusively military problem. China, until the 19th century, really never faced countries of equal. China does not want the United States to be encroaching on China with close-in military bases and give the impression that we at some point might intervene militarily. America does not want China to be in a position where its military force becomes the overhanging element in relationships. But that is also partly inherent in the situation, because even historically, China has never relied on its military force as the leading element of its expansion. China has converted conquerors, and it has sometimes grown more by osmosis than by conquest. America is not in a position, after our experiences in the last 3 or 4 wars, of thinking of itself as an expeditionary force in Asia. So we need to be able to give expression to this reality. But at the same time, we need to do certain things together. It's not enough to avoid conflict. There are issues like Korea, like freedom of the seas, like nuclear proliferation in general, on which, when China and the United States cooperate, their influence on the world will be extremely great, and where I think the interests of the two sides are essentially compatible.
Well, you mentioned there are certain things both sides should do together. You mentioned North Korea, nuclear proliferations, a few things. But you did not mention climate change. Do you think climate change is part of international diplomacy?
I think I should have mentioned climate change, environment. We will be driven to doing it on cyber. So in the whole realm of new technology and new impacts on humanity, it is an area where we should cooperate. But what we need it's some programs that Chinese and Americans do together, so that there develops on each side a group of people who have worked together, and where it's not simply a theoretical point.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. Now, your 1972 trip to China is a classical case in history. You have experience with 5 generations of Chinese leaders. Whom impressed you most?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about about the 5 generations, and I'll answer your question in a minute, but the interesting thing is that each of them represented one stage of a historic experience, and that perhaps none of them could have done what they did without their predecessors. So Mao was the founding father. He was the person who unified the country and who realized what he said in his opening statement as leader, which is China had stood up. He did it at horrendous costs and at unbelievable suffering, which, however, in the Chinese myth about itself, is superseded, at least from what I can observe, by his role in unification. You couldn't have a Mao in every generation and keep the society together. It was a one-time phenomenon. Deng Xiaoping tried to take the positive elements of Mao and enable the Chinese people at the same time to liberate their extraordinary inventiveness and energy. And it would have been unthinkable in the Mao period to say what Deng said, I don't care whether a cat is black or gray as long as it catches mice. So that meant we will adopt any. Then Jiang Zemin, who was greatly underestimated when he started, brought China back into the international community after Tiananmen. And Hu Jintao was the expression of saying, we've had enough turmoil and excitement for a while. Now let's steady the society. And now we have a new leadership that wants to make another big step forward by reforming the party, reforming the country, and but the leaders of each generation that I've known, they can't be compared in the abstract because they were leaders that fitted into their time and that on the whole did the job that they were supposed to do.
So you do give everyone an A+.
No, there were different levels of energy. Mao was a prophetic type. I mean, he wanted to implement in his lifetime visions that normally you would do would evolve in centuries. He did that job with brutal consistency and enormous suffering. So for an outsider, it's very difficult to accept this, but I'm talking in terms of what did they accomplish.
We have such a distinguished audience here. I think if I don't open the floor, and the Asian society will not give me a lunch. So let's open the floor, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Okay, Hamid. Okay. Please be short, just your name. Oops.
Sorry, Hamid Biglari. Dr. Kissinger, you always view foreign policy from the perspective of a historian. One of the important ways in which the world is different from the past today is the greater economic interdependence among...
the world is different.
Sorry, do you have, one of the ways in which the world is different from the past is the greater degree of economic interdependence among countries. So my question is, in a world where geoeconomics can't be differentiated from geopolitics, what is the implication of that on international relations when the view of the world order among different leaders is not only different, but in some cases can be mutually incompatible?
I think I'm writing a book more or less on that subject right now. And when people ask me, I tell them, when I get to my last chapter, after I've done all that great analysis, I'll give it the heading, and therefore what? Because the driving force of geoeconomics are not necessarily the same as the driving force in geopolitics. And the tendencies, the mere fact that the globalization produces almost organically crises, which then, when they happen, have to be dealt with by political means, because countries cannot afford to let them run to their course, creates a gap between the geopolitical and the geoeconomic approach. And the institutions we have are not really bridging that. We have the G8 and the G20. When the G8 was started, I was still in government. I was at the first meeting. The idea then was to have the three top people of a government, of each government, were the only people that were permitted to sit at the table. And they could have one or two advisors behind them. And the idea was that there would be a sort of philosophical discussion of the implications of what each of them was doing for long-range policy. That lasted about 2 meetings. And then the pressures of being able to show some result pulled these meetings back into the day-to-day activities. And so whatever think pieces were developed by them did not emerge out of the discussions. And so there are really no institutions that relate these two to each other. You see in the Ukraine now. It's amazing to me that a negotiation whose end result would be to tie Ukraine to Europe was discussed at the was handled at the second or third level of the European Commission by a purely economic department. And therefore, to the extent that they succeeded, they were going to produce a political crisis inherent in the nature of Russia's relationship to Ukraine. I have favored, and I still favor, that a relationship of Ukraine to Europe, but that should have been discussed as a political issue as these other negotiations were advanced.
Well, you see the failures, but follow that questions. What is your solution for 21st century international affairs? I understand that you are writing a book. Can you tell us a little bit of your secret of your book?
No, there's no secret to my book. And one is permitted to analyze a problem without having to offer solutions to every problem one recognizes. The 21st century has some of the problems that we described. It has the problem that it is also the period of a change in human consciousness. First, because some of the problems are unprecedented, but also because the way to acquire and distribute information is a radical shift from the previous generation. And it produces, when you learn from a screen and when you can evoke answers at the pressing a button, it becomes easier, much, much easier to get answers. But maybe you lose a bit in the ability to formulate questions because it's so simple. So I would say there are underlying problems which, if it were possible to identify and to institutionalize a relatively small group of wise men whose job it should be not to solve every problem, but to say, here is our understanding of where this is going. That would be a contribution. And I mean, this purpose here was not my book. My book analyzes the problem and how it arises. Mm-hmm. And it talks about ways it should be thought about. But we are talking here about a historic process which we have just begun. And even with my self-confidence, I don't assert that I have all the solutions. But I think 30,000 people in the various bureaucracies, I mean, I think the nature of the first thing I was asked at breakfast with a small group, I was asked the question, why are we so often surprised? And my answer was, it isn't that the information wasn't available. It's because our conceptual apparatus for dealing with it had not been appropriately focused. If we had made enough studies of the nature of revolutions, we would have known that assembling people in Tahrir Square was the beginning of a long process, not the end of a process. And we would have analyzed who the forces were that were likely to appear in the course of such a process. And now we are going through many changes around the world whose components we need to understand before we can offer solutions.
Yeah, you mentioned surprise. We had so many surprises in the past few years, from Arab Spring to Ukraine crisis country. What will be the next surprise you see? You will say the world will keep in peace forever.
No, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm concerned. Everybody talks now about how strong Russia is and how aggressive. I think in the long term, one has to be concerned about the weakness rather than the strengths of Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, the lady in the front. Mac, please.
Dr. Kissinger, how are you today? How practical is the concept of Iran, of containment of a nuclear Iran?
How is it possible to contain a nuclear Iran?
How practical? There are people that embrace the idea that Iran can be contained once they have a nuclear bomb. And that concept, is that a realistic concept for world peace?
Well, I have often said, when I was in government, nuclear deterrence was the official governmental policy. And I was one of the people who would be asked if the issue were ever raised. And to me, the most anguishing reflections when I was in office was, what would I say if the president ever came to me and said, I've exhausted all diplomacy, it's just the time to go to the war plan? Because everybody knew that that involved tens of millions of casualties. Now, it never got to that point. It never got close to that point. But we were dealing here with two sophisticated countries who had elaborated warning systems, complex methods of control, and you couldn't slide into a nuclear war on the basis of the mood of the moment because of the self-interest. But when you get countries with limited resources, less experience, smaller capabilities, confronting each other over shorter distances, the possibility of miscalculation rises enormously. Secondly, Iran will not be operating alone in this environment. The almost certain outcome will be that a number of other countries will also acquire nuclear weapons. And then you get a whole new set of equations that emerge in that situation. And if you imagine a Syrian civil war type situation where you have nuclear countries and you can't tell who is who, that would be a truly chaotic situation. So I think the development by Iran of nuclear weapons will be a fateful step in the evolution of the post-war period. On the other hand, it will be very, very difficult to stop at this point, because where we are in the negotiations, it would take superhuman abilities to get Iran to move from where it is to where we want it to be.
Yeah. Let me get it back. A lady in the middle in white. Yeah, yes. Mac, please.
I was just wondering what you think the younger nations can do to strengthen the ties between our nations.
Can you say again? The back don't work.
Sorry, the younger generations, what they can do to strengthen the ties.
Exactly.
No,
How strengthen the ties of the younger generation?
strengthen the tie of the younger generation, yeah.
And what's the question?
How to do it?
Yeah, how to strengthen this is the current affairs with the younger generation. This is a young lady from the 22nd century.
Well, I don't know what it would mean by strengthen the younger generation. If you think, how does one organize them as a political group so that they can express themselves? That's one thing. I think the problem of the younger generation in the age that we are now developing is that when you are linked together with X hundreds of friends, and some of my grandchildren are, how do you develop enough identity to face the issues that come up to you in the course of life? If you need to be verified all the time by Twitter or Facebook or whatever they are, that's a problem that concerns me. I have no answer to it.
Do you have a Twitter?
I don't use any of it.
You don't know.
But that's not, That's not out of moral superiority. It may be a sign of arrogance. I don't care what 500 people think. I want to find out first what I think. Look, I'm not saying that invidiously, because in the young generation, that's where you are. You have these possibilities. All your friends do it. You can't separate yourself. So the answer to my question is not the way I live, because I never knew these things. And I don't have an answer to that question. To that second question.
Yeah, this is a question for the young generation. Looking for the next 10 years, 20 years, next 50 years, for her generation in terms of international affairs, you're more optimistic or you're less optimistic, you're even more pessimistic?
I think when you deal with a historical process, you shouldn't deal with it as entertainment. I asked a leading political figure in the world, I said, to what extent, and he was my generation, so it's not a good test of this, said, to what extent are you influenced by the younger generation? And he said, the problem is that the younger generation wants an event, not a conclusion. They want an experience, not an outcome. So you cannot tell, I'm telling you what he said, you cannot tell the depth of their conviction from their excitement on any one occasion. So what I would say is the real issue is not to be committed. The real issue is to deepen your knowledge, to develop a sense of the evolution of events, so that politics or policy doesn't degenerate into a series of ad hoc emotional moves that satisfy a particular emotion, but not the problem that you're supposed to deal with.
Yeah, that's really answers your question. Now, Dr. Kissinger, the longevity is aging obsessions. And you're at the age of 90, but your mind is still as sharp as a razor. What is your secret?
I was very smart in selecting my parents. Both of whom lived to the age of 98.
Ah.
But I'm heading there, so it's...
No, then you can go at least to 150.
Well, there was at a birthday celebration of some European leader, somebody made a toast and said, I hope you live to the biblical age of 120. And he said, why put a limit to the grace of God?
It's a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger, to share your wisdom with us, with everyone here this morning. Please join me, give another warm, a big applause for Dr. Kissinger.